Здравствуйте, дорогие друзья! Это видео можно посмотреть с русскими субтитрами. Для того, чтобы их включить, следуйте инструкции на ваших экранах.
Hello, dear friends. We are continuing our Peacebuilding dialogue series. And today we will talk about few reasons for global confrontation. Are non-conflict solutions possible? Geopolitics, globalization models, United States, China, Russian Federation, European Union, Global South, international trade and technology, commodity competition. And today I have a very distinguished guest in our show. First, Professor Stephen Eric Bronner, Rutgers University, United States. Professor, hello.
Hello. It's
Hello.
a pleasure to be here. And thanks for inviting me for such an important occasion.
It's a pleasure for us. We really appreciate that you obtained this invitation. And also we have a researcher, Doctor of History, Head of International Council for Diplomacy and Dialogue in Eastern Europe, expert in the United Nations Security Council, Antiterror Division, Valery, Engel, Latvia. Valery, hello.
Hello.
Dear friends, dear colleagues, I'm really glad to see you. We are talking about this topic in very important, crucial even time. And I hope this dialogue will bring some important thoughts to the peaceful resolution, not only in Ukraine, but all around the world. Professor Stephen Bronner, please, it's time for your introduction speech.
Well, thank you. Let me see if I can begin this way. That I am the co-director of the International Council for Diplomacy and Dialogue. And so I've been lucky enough to be involved in a number of different peace efforts in my background. And it seems to me we have to begin by recognizing that it's not we, the advisors, the NGOs, who make peace. What we can do is contribute to making peace. And that I think can occur, in a number of different ways. We can provide geopolitical research. We can make speculative suggestions for resolving conflicts. We can raise possible compromises that have been ignored. And we can, above all, question common assumptions about geopolitical peace building. I want to focus on the latter. And the place to begin, I think, is with the meaning of geopolitical. Usually the term is understood in terms of particular states seeking to maximize their competitive advantage through alliances, treaties, and economic or military aid. But I think this standpoint is somewhat outmoded. Today, geopolitical conflicts must be understood less in terms of discrete states in action than how these states are shaped by transnational actors, transnational trends, and transnational interests. This has actually been the case with all the great revolutions going back to the age of democratic revolution. Notice I didn't use revolution in the plural. One of America's greatest historians, R.R. Palmer, when he was at Princeton, saw all the revolutions from 1688 through 1789, the English events to the American to the French, as part of the same process, as part, or if you like, part of the same revolution. And I think you can see this today, although it's not discussed in these terms, with the anti-communist uprisings, which were all interconnected, and the Arab Spring, and quite remarkably, the rise of right-wing extremism. This is one phenomenon. And it seems to me that this central phenomenon has to be dealt with as a transnational phenomenon. All the states involved, all the European democracies at the moment are threatened by right-wing extremism, as certainly Valery well knows. The primary issue, I think, for all of them is displaced immigrants threatening their national identities. At the moment, we can talk about, at a minimum, 350 million migrants moving around Europe. That's what that I think is crucial for the threat posed to national identities. Second issue is, if you like, social movements, the women's movement, the gay movement, and the like. All of them are threatening traditionalism and traditional identities. And in a new way, I think the right-wing extremism, geopolitically understood, occurs through religious movements vying for hegemony. We can think of the Shia and the Sunni. This is not a national struggle. We can think of even the conflicts between Hindus and Muslims in India and Pakistan. Again, not a national struggle. We can think of ISIS throughout North Africa and elsewhere, or Al-Shabaab in different states of Africa. What also seems clear to me is that the struggles for national self-determination today are taking transnational form. Palestine is supported by Lebanon, Iran, Yemen, and other states. Israel is intertwined with the United States and Europe. The Russian-Ukraine war is quite obviously a proxy war, since without foreign aid from the United States and NATO, Ukraine would be unable to continue. By the same token, Russia is supported by Iran, to a certain degree by India. And I think we have to take into account China with its Silk Road initiative that might very well move through Eastern Europe. In any event, we have this situation where geopolitical activity occurs on both sides of the barricades, but we seem as advisors and as intellectuals to somehow forget that both sides to a conflict have the right to seek geopolitical support. Somehow, for Hamas to seek support from Iran or Hezbollah is terrorism, whereas Israel seeking support from the United States for its worst imperialist policies, that's okay. That's an understandable action by one of America's allies. Now, it seems to me that this transnational context has to start from the standpoint of impartiality, or dealing with this transnational context has to begin from the standpoint of some kind of impartiality, from the standpoint of the peacekeepers, which, by the way, is not taking place in most instances. We can see at the moment the even NGOs uncritically lining up with Palestine. That's a case in point. We see that different factions in the United States all of whom say they want peace, simply side with either Ukraine or Russia. It seems to me that the first instance or the first concern for those who want to build peace is to seek impartial transnational actors as moderators or as mediators within a conflict. And it only follows from this, since it's a transnational conflict, that all participants in the conflict must have a seat at the table. The idea that Russia and Ukraine will simply sit down together and hash out their problems, I think, is an outmoded approach. It's clear that supporters of the two sides are going to have an influence on what is done. This, I think, should be transparent, open, and basically involve them in the peace building process. The second thing, it seems to me that there has to be a prior agreement before people sit down or representatives sit down, that both sides of a conflict, precisely because they're threatened not only by their opponents, but by transnational forces, both sides to the conflict must have their security concerns met, at least in principle. Point number two. Point number three, most of what I mentioned as being transnational is located in civil society. You can think of religious issues, you can think of traditional communitarian issues, you can think of fear of immigrants. This is primarily generated by civil society. What I think the logical consequence is that the peace building process must be informed in some way through representatives of civil society, because we can't make the assumption that the interests of the state or the political organization is the same as the interests of civil society. If I can say so, the Hamas is a case in point. We can probably do the same thing for Israel, but it's simpler here. The idea that one can unleash an attack on Israel and not have the clientele of Hamas suffer, and perhaps suffer disproportionately, is absurd. If the leaders of Hamas did not see this coming, they're culpable. If they did see it coming, then this is an act of cynicism, which is pretty extreme. Basically, one is sacrificing 30,000 people in order to bring the Palestinian issue back on the table, where it will remain for a while, but will then probably lose its seminal importance as it did previously. At any rate, that's an example of what I'm talking about. The other thing in terms of peace building is there have to be transnational agreements that allow for exit strategies by both state participants to the conflict. If we think of Ukraine and Russia, we're in a situation now. Part of the problem is that both governments have identified their fate, so to speak, with victory in the conflict. There's no way to get out, so to speak, with honor. Perhaps there is, but it's up to us to specify that more specifically. Specify that more concretely. So the final point is, in this regard, what happens the day after the conflict ends? How do we think of that? There has been, we've spoken about an international fund. I'm not quite sure what that means. And we've spoken about a new Marshall Plan, which is a somewhat shaky way of bringing the past to bear on the future. Because the Marshall Plan, part of its success was that funds were given to Europe for basically Europeans to restructure their societies. I'm not sure that this will work, it can work the same way in terms of the present governments, given the degree of corruption and incompetence that has been shown in the war. There's going to have to be some kind of international monitoring of the funds that are given. And I think in general, the role of international monitors, and this is, I know, an interest of Valery's, has to increase, not decrease. Now, if that's true, the ultimate goal of peace building is indeed peaceful negotiations over conflicts rather than violent confrontations. What I think needs to be done is, again, from an international standpoint, the International Monitoring Organization, we have to begin talking about, we being intellectuals, leaders of NGOs, activists, and the like, we have to begin talking about the arms trade. Without talking about that, it's almost like we're talking in the abstract. And I think that today, in the present situation, it's not simply one nation doing the selling and one nation doing the buying. Indeed, I think this is an interconnected trade, transnational trade, that should be treated the same way that drug smuggling and the major cartels are treated in the international community. We have barely begun to develop suggestions and policies to deal with this most important of all issues. This leads me to talk about what is the greatest transnational danger brought on by some of the conflicts that exist. Obviously, that is nuclear war. President Putin has, we say in English, saber rattled, saber being a sword, with the threat of nuclear arms. And of course, this has left his opponents, especially the United States, in a quandary of how to respond. This has always been the problem with mutually assured destruction. It assumes that both sides are smart enough to recognize that they will be destroyed. I think as modernity progresses, that assumption will become less and less prevalent. And indeed, this is, we can think about North Korea as a case in point.
Thank you, Stephen. I want to stand a question for Valery also on this situation. We all remember Francis Fukuyama, who claimed the end of history. He meant that the end of history is the end of geopolitical struggle because West won. He thought this.
Correct. It's
Yes.
a transformation. Right.
What was wrong with the President Fukuyama? Because we saw a lot of barricades around the world. Oh, big, huge, even barricade between Russia and the West. But in every region in the world, we saw bigger or smaller barricades between countries, between nations, inside of countries, sometimes between different social groups. What's going on? Why West not won this war like Francis Fukuyama thought before?
Thank you, Ruslan. Thank you,
Go ahead, Valery. You can.
Stephen. No, first of all, I want to say that it's not a very easy question how to stop the conflict. In general, I agree with Steve that it is an international question. If we're speaking about the global conflicts, we have to speak about the global players. What is the global players? It's a block of the several countries and two blocks of many countries. And okay, we can discuss about the main reasons of the beginning of the conflict. But I think there are two of it. It is the global competition for the global markets and the global competition for the political influence. In any case, to stop the global conflict, it's not only to win the war. Yeah, you can win the war, but it is only the halfway. It's only the half remedy for peace, because okay, you can be the winner, but you have to reconstruct your relationships with the loser. You have to find out the new rules of game with him and with his bloc. If we're speaking about the global conflict, it's a block of the countries. And you see, in this situation, there are only one way to construct the global common standards of the relationships. What I mean, first of all, the block of the common standards in security, in the security area. It is a system of the collective security, like, you know, it is some agreements about the limitation of weapons, about the arms control, maybe in policy, maybe the delimitation of the spheres of the influence, and maybe agreements of the non-interference in each other affairs, etc., etc. But it's not enough, because to get the long term of peace, you have to be partners with the former loser or with the former winner. What has been to be a partner? You can be a partner in the economy, you can be a partner in the culture, but by my point of view, it's more important thing to be a partner in the human rights. And therefore, the second part, the second block of the standards, of the new standards of the relationship, is the human rights block. Why? Because I think that maybe in the 90% of all global conflicts, the background of it, the formal reason, it was a violation of the rights of the some group of the population, maybe religious, like Stephen told, maybe ethnic, maybe, I don't know, race, and etc., etc. But it is a formal matter. Why we have to think about the human rights? Because if we work together to upload common human rights standards, if we try to prevent the violation of the human rights, so we have the less of occasion for the restarting of the conflict. And here in this area, we can to win in the war, but we don't have the enough possibilities to make the standards in security and in the human rights. It's impossible to say because, for example, we represent the democracy, we represent the democratic country, and therefore our obligation for the human rights are less than you because you are not democratic countries. You have to have the common standards.
Reciprocity, yeah.
And it is, by my point of view, the main question of the situation. No, I can give you the sample from our last history. In Ukraine, for example, if we are now the Ukrainian channel, for example, the Ukrainization of the educational system of Ukraine in the West Carpats, it was considered by the Hungarian government like restriction of the cultural influence of Hungary upon the Hungarian population in Ukraine, for example. It is also was a problem with further development of relationship with the two allies, because Hungary is a member of the European Union. And here in this situation, I not agree with Steve. He is saying that it's very important to sit down of Russia and Ukraine around the table and to start to speak about what? Because here we don't have here the conflict between two countries. We have the conflict between Russia and the Western world and the Western civilization.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying, Valery.
Behind Ukraine, yes, behind Ukraine, it is not only the United States but also the European Union of the Western civilization. And the goal of Putin is not only to collect the parts of the old civilization, old Soviet civilization, for example, but it is a suggestion to the West to start to speak about the delimitation of the modern world.
Yeah.
And here, it's only the possibility to start to speak, what about to speak with Russia if Western countries will be ready to speak about that.
I agree with that completely.
And the Western countries in Ukraine is not ready because they didn't finish the first stage. They didn't finish the war. So, by my point of view, we're now in the beginning of the global conflict. We are not in the end, if we're speaking about Ukraine. So
that's why, colleagues, I extended the question about geopolitics, because it looks sometimes that this geopolitical prize, the right to be the first to lead the globalization, is the main strategic goal for the main countries in the world now, for China, for United States, for Russia, not only to occupy the territories of Ukraine. Of course, it's only a small task in this way.
The goal of Russia is a stupid goal, you see, in the modern world.
And thank you a lot, Valery, for this great thought about that victory doesn't mean peace very often. Victory doesn't mean peace, but peace means respect and balance. If we are talking about the stable peace, long peace. But I want to stand one more question.
Just one point.
For Stephen, I'm going to pass for you and stand a question, and you can add what do you want. And you said about the very important and crucial important role of international negotiators in the peaceful process. But for me, sometimes looks like international negotiators are trying to play their own game due these negotiations in the sides. And sometimes these negotiators brings extra fee to this negotiation process. And sometimes they make a lot of troubles in this negotiation process. How to avoid this situation when the simple conflict which could be resolved by the sides are complicated by the negotiators, by their own interests?
I think to answer that, you can't answer it empirically in each instance, but what you can say is that the choice of negotiators, the choice of people who are engaged in the actual mediation have to be those with as little stake in the conflict as possible. In other words, it used to be that a state like Sweden or, Norway would be perfect for dealing with this. That's no longer clear, obviously, insofar as Sweden has joined NATO, but I think that would be the way to go. Just a word about, you mentioned Samuel Huntington's thesis about the end of history. It seems to me there are three assumptions that he makes. The first is that political conflict will give way in favor of economic competition. And that this would be multilateral, which is a very suspect claim. The second is that war will basically come to an end because all nations will wish to become republican states, and republican states traditionally don't make war on one another. That's true. They do make war, of course, on, shall we say, less economically developed states. And the entire history of imperialism is in some way shaped by states like England and the United States. In any event, in a certain way, Huntington assumes what has to be created, and here I basically agree with what Valery has said. The hassle with human rights is you can't presuppose that it exists on either side. That is something that can't simply work through by looking at constitutions or purely formal matters. For example, there was no more emancipatory constitution than the one that Bukharin put together for the Soviet Union just before he was killed. We have to see if the principles of the liberal rule of law and civil liberties and civil rights are being exercised. If they're not being exercised, there's a serious problem for Valery's position. What can be done is for the supporters of the different sides in the war to, in some way, predicate their aid on furthering human rights. In other words, this is precisely what will need to be done with Israel and the United States. In a certain way, that's what Chuck Schumer, our majority leader of the Democrats, wanted to point out to President Netanyahu by calling for new elections. The assumption is, though Israel is formally a democracy, the rights attendant on a democracy are not being exercised or incapable of being exercised. And the only way to bring that back or to change that situation is by putting riders on the aid that's given. So I think even the question of how to further human rights is going to take transnational forms of organization. I think we agree on that. Certainly Valery and I do. One of the other things I think, is that, and this happens all the time, it's in a way part of the impartiality question. I think intellectuals and policymakers have to be willing to criticize the side with which perhaps they sympathize. Nothing is more clear to me about the Palestine-Israel conflict than this. The Palestinian leadership, there's never been anything like it in terms of its incompetence. Former foreign minister said, Abba Eban once said that the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And I think that's true. But this is always excused by supporters of the Palestinian position. It's qualified. It's not taken head on. And forgive me. And it seems to me that's exactly what impartial analysts have to do. They have to be willing to confront both sides and speak truth to power on both sides, not one side.
Thank you, Valery. What to do with the problems of world's inequality? I'm talking about the poverty. I'm talking the technological differences between the countries. I'm talking about the cultural difference, political difference. Don't accept this simplification, maybe, but there is a very stand forms like Washington consensus to the geopolitical model and Beijing consensus, another geopolitical model. What to do with these differences, which without the good management will grow, will arise, are the ground of the rising over different problems. No.
Well, I think that you are speaking about the difference in civilization, because
economical, political, technology.
One of the principles of the difference between the civilizations is the development of the sacral culture model. Yes, it means the values. It means maybe the sacral texts and etc. etc. And by my point of view, the humanity is moving. The difference between these models are now less than it was 30 years ago, for example. I don't speak about the extremism. I don't speak, for example, about the Israeli-Hamas conflict, because by my point of view, Hamas is an extremist organization, is a terror organization.
Mm-hmm.
And the attitude of Israel to Hamas is we can consider like the attitude of the democratic state towards the terror group. Yes, it is a lot of problems in the victims regarding the victims in Gaza. But you see, it is the method of the struggle against terror. If the Hamas soldiers are using schools, kindergartens, and all other infrastructure like the instruments of the war, you are getting in the very difficult situation. But in general, if you're speaking about the culture, about the attitude, the main difference, I think, now between the culture model is the attitude is a priority of the human rights, or the priority of the right of the state.
But be honest, Valery, be honest, there are a few different conceptions of human rights.
Of course.
And how to make some universal product in this, how to make universal platform. Between we are living in the West concept of human rights. All we are living in West concept of rights, but the Arabian or Asian concept of human rights is different. Are different.
I don't think that's true.
Please correct me.
I'll tell you why. It's both theoretically and practically. Theoretically, the idea of human rights and national self-determination was, when it emerged out of the Enlightenment, national self-determination was linked to the idea of a republic, and it was considered universal. In other words, every nation has the right to engage in national self-determination. And only with a democracy do you know if the national will is actually being exercised. Now, that's the theoretical element. By the way, Micheline Shea, who was supposed to be here, she actually did her dissertation on this. And I think it's for me, actually, and it was an excellent piece of work. But the practical element is, look at the uprisings that are taking place. You think of the Arab Spring. You think of Tiananmen Square. You think of these uprisings in Iran by women. All of them make the assumption that what we want is human rights. We seek a secularization, which I think is what Valery was talking about before, a secularization of the legal values that we have. In other words, we're anti-theocratic. And I mean, what I was saying before about differentiating the interests of the state from the interests of civil society. If if President Xi speaks about national self-determination or human rights and leaves the determination of what is to be decided only to himself, that's not human rights, and that's not national self-determination. That is
Stephen, but let's be honest in this moment. ISIS, it's also a part of Arabic Spring. A lot of protests in Arabic world and Asia was very conservative protests. They were protests against power and for the conservation, for archaization, even the culture, the human rights concept. I'm special standing this provocative question. I understand, but we are intellectual. We need to talk about this.
Oh, of course. I'm not saying, Ruslan, that every movement in these areas is committed to human rights or republicanism. But what I'm saying is, it's no longer the case, I think, that you can basically talk about the clash of civilizations as Huntington did, because human rights is becoming human. It's being used constantly as a criterion for making judgments about conflicts. And as I say, the great uprisings, not the uprisings by terrorist sects, but again, Tiananmen Square or the Arab Spring or this incredible movement in Iran. Even in Africa, you see this. You see the same thing. I think that we have to make the assumption that progress, or if you like, a progressive politics, has to rest on this original idea of human rights as a universal concept. Otherwise, you have no right to secession.
I agree with you. Before Valery will answer, I will inform our viewers that we are talking about how to overcome differences, which are the soil of a lot of problems, a lot of conflicts. So this is this dialogue about human rights. It's dialogue about differences. Valery, please.
I think it's a very important question, because the main problem what we have now is the difference in the values. It is the war of values in the modern world. But it is experience of the partnership in the defense of the values. For example, the question of the struggle against extremism. Many countries and many civilizations, they understand extremism very different. For example, the American point of view is the violent extremism. The Russian point of view is the spread of hate, just on internet, and not towards the person, but towards the social group. And there are a lot of, but there is an understanding that the main evil for everybody is the terror. Violent extremism is understandable, the common goal of the all powers in the struggle against extremism. Okay, they found out the one goal, for example. They found out one value, the struggle against terrorism. If we're speaking about the other values, we can divide it in the social rights, and we can divide it, for example, the democratic rights, for example, freedom of speech. Okay, here is really the problem. But the question is that the humanity also agreed in the middle of the last century that there is some fundamental rights, what is important for everybody. And,
Exactly.
And the freedom of speech, the freedom of movement, freedom for life, and all other freedoms, they are fundamental human rights.
Exactly.
And those are negotiations what we have to have between several global players. It must be around these agreed human rights.
Agreed.
And in
Quite
this
so.
situation, will be much easier. All other what is connected with the traditions, with the religious traditions, with the ethnic traditions, is the question of the second part. The first part is to make
Right.
the global standards of the human rights and the base of the fundamental rights.
I couldn't agree more with that. And I think that this has to take precedence over everything. Unless one has some agreement on this, it's very difficult to move forward at all. I think that's exactly.
The right for a life is a fundamental right of the people. And therefore, the powers agreed in the question of the struggle against terror. They didn't agree to struggle against the spread of hate towards the social group, because there's another fundamental freedom is the freedom of speech. It's the First Amendment in the American Constitution, what is accepted by a lot of other Western countries.
We talk about this as inalienable rights.
Yeah.
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 In other words, you can't get rid of them. You can't sell them. You can't do it. They're just there. And it also seems to me that the idea of social rights and civil or legal rights are very much connected. Kant always, and this is quite correct that you emphasize this freedom of speech. Kant saw freedom of speech as the precondition for all other rights, which, by the way, makes sense if you think about it. Because if you can't talk, you can't organize. And if you can't talk, you can't resist in terms of, you can't build solidarity. Developing this or realizing this, though, I think is going to take into some degree of transnational pressure, or pressure that comes from outside dictatorial states. In the United States, by the way, right now, the crucial debate is whether hate speech is extremism. That's right now going on. this is the controversy over Elon Musk and TikTok and I'm sorry, the internet, and it's a very complicated question, but I think one has to in some way privilege the idea of freedom of speech as a universal. Perhaps the point at which that is limited is when free speech itself is denied. In other words, you can't use free speech to deny free speech.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if you do that, I think you will wind up in a situation where the legitimacy of extremist groups, whether they're hate groups or violent groups, is going to be dealt with in a, shall we say, a power-inspired manner. In other words, you want to marginalize them, and that will take power as well as persuasion.
Colleagues, and of course, I have the end of our today's dialogue in our this third series of our peaceful dialogues. I have a Ukrainian question. How do you think, what geopolitical conditions do we need to end the Russian-Ukrainian war? What could be changed in geopolitical level to the end in this war?
For me, the first step would be the United States can't unconditionally give aid. It has to, in some way, link this aid with steps either towards peace, furthering human rights, whatever the steps might be to move the country towards peace and a negotiated solution to the conflict. That would be, to me, the first step that has to be made. And as for the rest, in some way, you know better than I what it would take to move President Zelensky towards abandoning his position. That actually, both Putin and Zelensky, this is the impartiality question, both assume that their conditions, that their own ends are met before they'll talk. And that's not what negotiation is about. You can't say, I'm only willing to talk to Russia if Russia has pulled out its troops. Then there's nothing to talk about. By the same token, Putin saying, well, we can't begin talks unless it's agreed that we keep Crimea and various other areas. That won't work. Negotiation means that the ends you want to achieve are on the table for negotiation and compromise.
Well,
and the only way to push that is transnationally. China can do it with Russia if it wants to. The United States can do it with Ukraine if it wants to.
Thank you, Valery.
In general, I agree with Steve because by my point of view, it is a question. Today, I don't see the possibilities to stop it. We can freeze the conflict.
Mm-hmm.
We can reach the military frozen the conflict, but it's not the solution.
No, it's not the solution.
Just I don't see how it's possible to do without an intermediary, a new intermediary.
Yeah.
And I totally agree with Steve here that China can be such kind of intermediary. I don't need if China needs it, but in general, theoretically, China could be such kind of intermediary.
Yeah.
China can use economical instruments for moving both sides of conflict to the peace.
Yeah. I think that also.
United States in this case also theoretically could be a partner of China in this invasion, because they don't have an influence upon Russia, but they have the influence upon Ukraine, and
Exactly.
and China has the influence upon the both sides, but more upon Russian Federation.
Yeah.
But it's theoretically. Practically, I don't know if China needs it.
Yeah.
I don't
In
know.
fact, Valery, you can even make the argument that it serves China's interest if the war continues, because the United States.
Point of view, it can be. Yes, I'm not sure, but it can be.
I'm not sure either, but
yes,
yeah.
But it's also the other problem, because the United States consider China like a geopolitical competitor, like the geopolitical enemy. It is not. It is not the way of the partnership, because the peace in Ukraine, it could be, by my point of view, only on the way of the partnership between China and United States, in the way of the long-term peace in Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
If we can imagine that Trump will come now to the power in the White House, I'm absolutely sure that we can't speak about any partnership with these two great powers.
Yeah.
Okay. In this case, we can speak theoretically about the, but by my point of view, when the beginning of the conflict, in this conflict will be developed. It could be partly frozen, but in some time, when the transfer of the European economy to the way of the war will be finished, I think the conflict will be growing up.
Thank you, Valery. I also agree that we need new geopolitical balance for stable peace. In other case, we can achieve a victory, we can achieve an attrition of the sides, we can achieve a lot of scenarios, but every of them leads us to a new dangers of revenge in the future, the new dangers of a conflict in future. Thank you for this great dialogue. We were talking about differences, geopolitics, how to achieve the stable peace. And today I have a very distinguished guest, Professor Stephen Bronner and Dr. Valery Engel. Thank you, friends, very much.
Thank you. Thank you, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.